Hello. I'm one of those people you have to blame or whatever for the upcoming European referendum. I voted in 1975 for the removal of trade barriers and tariffs to create a free trade area. I hasten to add that had I been asked to vote in favour of membership of what we're now faced with, I would have rejected it out of hand, as I suspect most of the people in Great Britain would have done. However, we now have to come to deciding whether or not we wish to be part of the European Economic Community, Common Market, EU, whatever they choose to call it. They'll select whichever name they believe causes least public complaint. I also believe that we would have voted against it had, at that time, anybody or it been suggested that we were going to subject ourselves to pseudo or whatever leadership of this community by Germany. Germany in particular, as we'd resisted their attempts to control Europe in two major world wars, and we were now, or are now, succumbing to their control over Europe economically. Now, one of the major problems in making this decision is that the people we have given the authority to make the decision for us, or to advise us on what makes sense and what doesn't in various contexts, are the very people who are our biggest problem. With the political system we have now, there is no motivation to be honest with us at all at any stage of any year, on any subject, if it comes to that. Now, we were informed at the time of that referendum that were this group to be expanded at all, to include other nations who were geographically within the boundaries of Europe, as it were, that there would be a requirement for, generally speaking, parity in their economy with the existing countries. I believe there were 8 countries at that time. I may be wrong, but it was something like that. 8 countries subscribing to a common market. We now have 28 countries where parity is the very last question that is posed before somebody gains entry. I think Turkey and somebody else are on the threshold, as it were, of being admitted. And there's little doubt they will be admitted because the Eurozone is desperate for additional revenues and support. But the very interesting factor, at least in my memory, which can of course always be incorrect, but as I see it, this question of parity disappeared with the reunification of Germany. East Germany was, to all intents and purposes, another country, and it became part of the community, as they call it, at the whim of West Germany. And we've been paying for it, basically, ever since. I remember it being said at the time, I can't remember the exact statistics, but somebody said, I believe, that a sort of average member of the German middle classes, as it were, in West Germany, at the time the Berlin Wall came down, could have bought a 3-bedroomed house in East Germany for, I believe it was said, 2 or 3 days' pay. In other words, the inadequate parity between the two economies was absolutely ghastly, I mean huge. And so it was therefore necessary for all thought of parity thereafter to be thrown over the hedge, so to speak. We won't be asked to do that again because there is no need to cross that barrier. Our politicians have led us up this path, and we're now in a situation where quite clearly there is no merit in actually being part of this grouping, none whatsoever. The world is a smaller place. It's a global economy, as people love to tell you. We don't really have to trade with Europe. Or let's put it another way, we don't really have to be a signed up member of a community in order to trade with Europe. Europe is a geographical area, is close to us. We buy enormous amounts of goods and services from the EC, especially Germany, and they're not going to give that away in a hurry. Indeed, if Angela Merkel was to suggest that we had just left the community and she or they or whatever they call themselves were going to put up barriers against our trading in Europe, or we would no longer be welcome as a trading partner of Europe, I think she'd be visited the following morning by voices from Mercedes and BMW and a number of others. And if she didn't forget the idea, she'd find herself very quickly a memory in Germany. She'd be removed from office as quicker than the weather changes. So there are no fears whatsoever on that score. The major fear we have and should have is immigration. Now, this subject is often avoided in real detail because the political correct nature of our lives these days seems to indicate that we're supposed to be racists if we have anything to say about the people who are coming into our country. I hasten to add this has got no bearing on Europe as such, other than this ridiculous so-called free movement of labour between one country and another. I always used to argue that if you put 10 people in a field with £1 each and went back a year later, one of them would be drunk up the corner, one would have died, 3 would be starving, and whatever the number is, the other 5 would be all in the hands of one person who had managed to exercise control. And this is always going to happen within a so-called community, which in itself is a joke. It's not a community at all. It's a group of people who are pretending they're not competitors. These people are competitors of ours in every sense of the word, and if we don't recognise that, then reality will insist that we do at some point in the relatively near future, in my opinion. But as I said, the biggest problem we have is immigration. We can't, as a nation, go on accepting people into these islands and expect to maintain our infrastructure intact, or indeed to maintain a national identity. Now, I don't mean this I don't mean to say that I have anything against the people at least in my experience, the people I've met who've come from other parts of Europe or other parts of the world. Indeed, in my cricketing days, I played with a general United Nations of people, and I got along pretty well with all of them. But the only criteria that were applied in that environment was, could they play the game? Were they good enough? That was the first thing. In other words, some sort of point system. Could they play the game? Were they the people we could look to help sustain the team's position? And the other one, which is a purely personal one, is, do you like the individual or don't you? There's no law that says one human being ought to like another, nor is there a law that says in some way, shape or form, if you don't like somebody, you shouldn't cooperate with them in various ways. Now, I have no love for the Germans or the French, but that's a personal opinion. But I've known Germans and I've known French people who I got along with very well indeed and will continue to get along with. There's no reason not to. But we can't go on expanding the numbers of people who are coming into these islands without losing our national identity. Now, I'm the first people to suggest, when I hear these conversations about that these people should integrate with us when they come into the country. Well, a Frenchman coming into England is going to be a Frenchman if he stays here for 50 years. The same would apply to any other nationality in the world. And people of any religion whatsoever, if they are that way inclined, will retain their allegiance to that religion, or those religions, probably for the rest of their days. And why not? But this is England. And you'll notice I say England and not Britain. Because I believe there's a Welsh identity, there's an Irish identity. Indeed, there's fast becoming a North and South Irish identity. There's a Scottish identity, a Welsh, etc., etc. And nothing we do, no matter how much we travel to and from these various countries, I don't know how many Scottish people there are in England and vice versa, but the fact still remains, whether they're in their own country or in one of the other countries of the United Kingdom, they retain their national culture and identity. It's natural. It's the way it's genetic, virtually. So here we are, accepting, or being asked to accept, that the criteria we use to assess whether or not people should come into this country is purely economic. Or do these people make a contribution? I'm quite sure they do. Do we make a contribution when we go to their countries? I'm sure we do that. And did we do that, and did they do that before the EEC or EU or Common Market came into being? Yes, the answer is yes, of course they did. One of the things that's not popular to say these days is that, well, when I was a lad, for example, when I first went to school at the age of 4, there was a big map on the wall that was, I don't know what percentage was pink, but we were taught that the pink was the British Empire. Now, at the time, you look at it, and you look at the size of our island in comparison with the rest of the geography of the world, and it's amazing that we could have had so much influence and claim so much territory, when, let's face it, the territory we were visiting that became coloured pink was not ours to claim. We simply imposed ourselves on them. Now, I'm not suggesting that for one moment that no good came out of that whatsoever, nor am I suggesting that it was all good, that it was something wonderful about the British Empire. There simply wasn't. And there would be a tendency here at home for people, or some people, to talk about the empire as if it was some sort of wonderful thing, where the only traffic of whatever nature was in one direction, where we gave our knowledge and supreme experience to the rest of the world, which was absolutely stupid and obviously incorrect. But it's also true to say that those countries have not suffered in any way, shape or form since we left anyway, and they endeavour to demonstrate their national identity. Now, that being the case, we wish to retain, or at least as far as I'm concerned, I believe the majority of people in this country want to retain the English, Irish, Scottish culture and identity that at least we once had. And I don't disagree with that in any way, shape or form. In fact, I'm in favour of it. But neither am I confident that the people we elect under the system we elect them, to supposedly represent our interests, excuse me, that they in fact do that. I mean, when we come to this referendum, where will be the informative process that's forthcoming from government, for example? There won't be one. They suggest that they're going to do an assessment of this, but it won't be an assessment done in objective terms to inform the public about what leaving or staying in the EC means. It will be coloured by a desire, for reasons which defeat me, for us to subjugate our national identity totally to being European or just a part of the world. And if we start to do that, we shall become a small island off the coast of Europe with very little future. But if we take our future into our own hands, which surely we must do, we didn't build the empire, right or wrong, as I said before, we didn't build that by relying on other people. We did that ourselves, of our own volition, and then in so doing, what transpired. As I see it, there can be no case made for our staying in Europe, none whatsoever. In fact, as I said, were I to be called upon to, or had I been called upon to vote in favour of what now exists, in 1975 or whenever it was, there's no question at all I'd have rejected it out of hand. And I believe that this is true of most people of my generation who clearly wish, quite sensibly, to be part of any free trade area. It makes sense. Artificial tariffs and protectionism in trade is not a good idea. I also believe that the permanent and total and regular reference to everything in financial terms and economic terms is not the way to look at the world. The way I treat my neighbour doesn't depend on how much he earns or how much I earn. It depends upon common decency and humanity, and I hope will continue to do so. Of course, in the world, that's not so. The vested interests and bigotry and bias demonstrated by politicians the world over will see the end of the human race, and will certainly see the end of, for example, British dominance of the British Isles, or British control over the British Isles will totally disappear. All we do by staying in the EC is to shorten the day when that arrives. So I thought I'd say a few words, as I'm never shy about saying a few words, to simply indicate that I, for one, I hope, don't view a world, shall we say, peopled by President Trump and Prime Minister Corbyn with any degree of optimism at all. The only reason that we can accept David Cameron, as far as I'm concerned, as Prime Minister, is that there's no obvious indicator of statesmanship or talent demonstrated by any of our politicians, because they subscribe to, as I've argued many times, as they subscribe to the party political ideal. They're biased, they have vested interests, and in any event, they're controlled by money. In the same way that Mercedes and BMW dictate what, and I'm sure there are others, dictate what Angela Merkel's happy to do, or will or won't do. So indeed is that true in the UK and in America. I think it was Gore Vidal who said that every American president had been bought at least 10 times over before he got the job. I also have stated many years ago that I thought in order to get into the higher reaches of a British political party, no matter what its colour, you needed to be a raging hypocrite, because no honest man or woman would ever find their way at the head of it, because it's impossible to do that. The so-called, well, it's a misuse of the word compromise. I prefer to call it graft. In other words, awarding people rewards for supporting this point of view or that point of view is not the way to do it. The way to do it is to produce, or to have groups of people who argue in favour of policies on the grounds of whether or not they believe they're right. It's got nothing to do with the party maintaining its power, etc., etc., but that is another subject. So I simply thought I'd say a few words, because in my view of the situation, for what it's worth, we should have no part of the European community, none at all, in signed-up terms. We should subscribe to no treaties whatsoever. We will agree to sell to Europe or any other country in the world those goods that they want to buy. We would agree to buy anything from goods and services from anywhere in the world that we consider sensible from our own point of view. And we would wish that other countries would do that. That's the way I believe we should conduct ourselves. But at the same time, I believe we must retain the British identity, or the various pieces of the British identity, if this country is to have any future in the world. And that has to start now. We've gone on far too long without it. And I would therefore urge everybody to vote to come out of the European community, or whatever you call it, to trade with Europe and the rest of the world, and conduct ourselves in a way that we have always prided ourselves as British. Thank you.